Thank you for joining today's call hosted by the Jewish Democratic Council of America. My name is Ron Klein and I'm chair of JDCA. In the 2+ years since our founding, JDCA has established itself as the national voice of Jewish Democrats, advocating for Jewish and democratic values such as expanding voting rights, combating the rise of hatred and bigotry, expanding access to affordable health care, and other important issues. Given the American Jewish community's history as refugees and immigrants, it's certainly in our DNA as we know it. These values include welcoming the stranger, and JDCA is a strong supporter of both refugee resettlement and humane immigration reform that's consistent with our values. Several weeks ago, JDCA launched the Democrats Leading in Crisis Call series to highlight Democratic leadership and expertise amid this crisis, looking at every aspect of this pandemic and how it's impacting our lives. We've brought together members of Congress, experts, and hundreds of you on each call. JDCA is here for you as a source of information and expertise at a time when it matters the most. Today, we're going to take a look at America's global leadership role amid crisis, as well as refugee resettlement issues and immigration. We are delighted to have with us today two Jewish leaders in this field, Senator Ben Cardin, a leader on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the CEO of HIAS, Mark Hetfield. And before I go any further, I just want to specifically single out Senator Cardin. You have been a friend of our Jewish community in not only Maryland, but throughout the country. You've led on the fights against anti-Semitism, obviously support of Israel as well, but so many issues that are important to our community. You've also been a friend of the Jewish Democratic Council of America and predecessor organizations, and we just want to say thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
Both our speakers are here today to answer your questions, so please send your questions to info@jewishdems.org. That's info@jewishdems.org. We're thrilled to get more questions on our last call than we've ever had before, so keep them coming, and we'll try to get to all of them. On Twitter, #PoundJewishDemsInAction. Lastly, please go to our website at jewishdems.org. Jewishdems.org, that is a place where you will find lots more information about Jewish Dems as our Jewish Democratic Council organization, how to get involved, and how to support us. Now, I'm going to ask JDCA Board Vice Chair, Barbara Goldberg Goldman, who will introduce our first speaker, Senator Cardin. Barbara?
Ron, thank you very, very much. It's always a treat when I am able to introduce not just my own senator, but also my own senator and dear friend, Senator Ben Cardin. He was first elected to the Senate in 2006 and currently serves as the ranking member of the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee. He's the senior member of the Senate Foreign Relations and Environment and Public Works Committees. He also served on the Senate Finance Committee. Senator Cardin is one of the leading voices, if not the leading voice in the Senate when it comes to advancing United States values in our foreign policy. He has worked across party lines to further our national security and protect human rights. In 2015, it was no surprise when he was named as the Special Representative on Anti-Semitism, Racism, and Intolerance for the 57-nation Organization Security and Cooperation in Europe. And currently, Senator Cardin serves as the ranking Democrat on the Helsinki Commission. From 1987 to 2006, Ben Cardin represented Maryland's 3rd Congressional District in the House of Representatives. And as a Marylander who has been represented by Senator Cardin for all those years, I can tell you firsthand that the people of our state and the Jewish community are incredibly grateful and proud for your remarkable leadership. Thank you again, Senator Cardin, for joining us today.
Well, Barbara, first of all, thank you for that very generous introduction. During these tough times, it's always nice to have a friend introduce you. So thank you very much. Thank you for what you do, not only on the Jewish Democratic Council, but what you do on so many different organizations in our community. You're one of our great activists. And Ron, your record of public service is just incredible. You're continuing to provide that we need in this country. Now more than ever before, that leadership is needed. So I really congratulate you in the mission that you're doing under the Jewish Democratic Council. And Mark, I know at HIAS, with the work that you're doing, we're proud of you. You represent the Jewish community, our Jewish values, and what we believe in is the right for our community and for the world community. Let me just start off by sharing with you our lunch conversation. When I say a lunch conversation, Democrats, all the Democratic senators meet every Tuesday at a Democratic caucus lunch. Now, this has been doing since the COVID-19. We're not personally present. We do it by telephone. But our guest at this lunch today was Melinda and Bill Gates. And we had a great conversation about the COVID-19, what we're doing to try to get it under control, and the importance of international leadership. If we're going to be able to develop an effective vaccine and have that vaccine distributed globally, we have to work with the global community. There's some practical aspects as to why it can only be done by the global community, because you have to have a large enough sample group. There are other issues about distribution that can only be handled through the international community. And the World Health Organization is our organizer of the international community's effort. All of Europe's participating and putting up hundreds of billions of dollars literally on this effort to make sure that we succeed in developing the cures, and vaccines and therapeutics and safety issues as it relates to COVID-19. There's one country missing, and that's the country that is normally in the lead whenever we do important things. We saw that on dealing with HIV/AIDS. We saw that with dealing with malaria. We saw that with dealing with so many of the international health pandemics. It was the United States leadership that organized the international community to deal what is our global responsibility. And by the way, it comes back to help us in the United States. If we don't control COVID-19 in what could happen in Africa, it will come back into the United States. We know that. The United States is missing in action because of Donald Trump. That's just one example of where our country is suffering under the failure of this administration to take action, to work with the global community. And by the way, take a look at the numbers in the United States. We're not doing very well. We're not doing very well because this administration squandered the time we had to be prepared for this. Instead of getting the testing capacity and having the protective equipment we need and having strategic plans and using the National Defense Act in order to protect our country, President Trump was telling us everything was okay. We didn't have to do anything, that this was like a seasonal flu. We paid a heavy price for his inconsistent messages to the American people. We want our president to lead with accurate information, but instead he played politics with this, costing us. So we've seen the failure of the Trump administration globally, as well as we've seen the failure of the Trump administration domestically as related to COVID-19. Barbara indicated that I am involved in the OSCE. I'm involved as the representative on anti-Semitism in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And I've been active in the Helsinki process for a long time. I was engaged with my colleagues in Europe about 10 days ago on what are we doing in response to COVID-19? Are we true to our values? We know that public health needs to be the #1 issue. It's our highest priority. We want to make sure we do everything we can to keep people safe, and that requires us to take extraordinary measures, and we understand that. But we have to wrap those measures within the values that make America a great country. And so when we take action that's going to infringe on people's rights, because we have to do it for public health, we have to do what's necessary. It has to be measured, and it should be temporary. And we should never use that as an excuse to compromise vulnerable people. The administration's comments about migrants, it's just outrageous. It has nothing to do with keeping America safe. It has everything to do with appealing to his right-wing base during a national emergency, during a pandemic. This is not what this country is about, our strengths and our values. And we always need to recognize that during difficult times, vulnerable communities become more vulnerable. And it's our responsibility to make sure vulnerable people are protected. I am proud of what the Democrats are doing in that regard. When you look at the action in the United States Senate, we held up Senator McConnell's original bill. Why? Because we wanted to make sure there was help for vulnerable people. We wanted to make sure that those that are on the front line got the services that they needed. We wanted to make sure that the social service programs could be funded, knowing full well there were going to be additional demands and less revenue coming into our social agencies. We demanded that, and we got that. And now as we look to the next round of what we're going to do in Congress on COVID-19, thank goodness the Democrats control the House of Representatives, because they're going to take the lead. And I can assure you that programs that speak to our values as Democrats and as Jews are going to be front and center in that bill, including how we handle our children, how we handle our seniors, how we handle our most vulnerable, to make sure there's adequate revenues at the local level so that they can perform essential services. Who depend on that the most vulnerable people in our community. So we're going to do everything we can in order to protect those types of programs. And you all make that possible for the work that you do. So Barbara was kind to say nice things about me. I'm just so proud of what you all do. I'm proud to have Barbara as my constituent, but I'm proud also to be a supporter of what you do as an organization, recognizing that our Jewish values is what makes us so proud, but it also represents the values of America, the values of our democracy. And as democracy is being threatened, as hate is rising in our community, as anti-Semitism is rising in our community, it's those values that give us the hope for a more safe and prosperous future. Let's hope that after November, we'll have both the House and Senate under Democratic control, and we're going to have Joe Biden as President of the United States. So with that optimistic forecast, thank you all very much. And if time permits, I'm more than happy to answer a few questions if that's how you want to proceed.
Great. Thank you so much, Senator. We do have some very interested JDCA supporters who have sent in questions. We appreciate your willingness to take a few. I'm happy to moderate them. Daniel Gordon has asked, the silence of Senate Republicans is shocking. Are there any Senate Republicans who recognize the reality and will speak up to confront Trump's incompetence? Or are they far too gone to expect that they will speak up? And I would just add to that, that you mentioned that you are back in session today, as of today, and if you could speak to what the Senate will be considering in the coming days and why Mitch McConnell has reconvened at this time in the Senate.
In the last Congress, we saw several Republican senators stand up and challenge the President Trump. John McCain, of blessed memory, he's no longer with us. Bob Corker, no longer with us. Jeff Flake, Republican, no longer with us. So yes, we had some senators in the last Congress, and in this Congress, we saw that Senator Romney showed incredible courage during the impeachment process, but they're very far and few between where the Republicans are standing up to this president. I find that very, very disappointing, because they're just fundamental issues that you have to put the country over party, and the Republicans have just not been doing that. And it really presents a challenge. You're asked, what are we going to do? Why are we back? Well, this week, there is absolutely no scheduled work dealing with COVID-19, none at all. What we expect is that Leader McConnell brought us back here to take up some of President Trump's right-wing appointments to the courts. Some of these are totally unqualified. We find a nomination to our circuit court of a person who's deemed unqualified by the ABA that is likely to get a vote on the floor of the Senate because it's a friend of Mitch McConnell. That's what we're coming back for, not for the work of keeping this country safe and getting our economy back on track. That we need to do. The House will return next week, and I expect you'll see some action on that next week in the House. I can tell you that we're going to continue to push in the Senate to deal with the pandemic and the consequences of the pandemic.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Yoni in California. You mentioned we're not doing well in terms of our international leadership and global response to the crisis. How can the U.S. be better working with our allies to combat COVID-19 and help find treatments or a vaccine? What damage has been done in this effort based on Trump's efforts, and how can we help heal these international relationships?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult to heal the damage that Donald Trump has done. I expect with a new president that we will be able to restore America's leadership globally moving forward. But damage has been done. Make no mistake about that. America is not looked upon today as a reliable ally. It's going to be very difficult for the international community to deal with this pandemic without the help of the United States. Why? Because we have the best research capacity, we have the most talented people, we have the labs that can do the work. And if that's not part of the international effort, then the international effort's not going to be as efficient and as timely as it needs to be. And the United States alone cannot do the type of testing trials that are going to be needed. So that's going to slow things down. And if the United States heads in one direction, the international community heads in a different direction in dealing with either a vaccine or therapeutics, and we don't have the universal distribution system set up the way it needs to be, that's going to delay things further. And if we have pockets of the spread of this virus that ends up coming into the United States, we'll find that it was a very, very counterproductive move. So it's going to be challenging in the next several months to do what's necessary without the U.S. leadership. We hope that Congress will help fill some of those voids. I mean, you mentioned the last question, will Republicans stand up to the president? Well, the Congress has stood up to the president in many, many different areas, in foreign policy issues and funding issues. And I'm hopeful that you're going to see again that the Congress will stand up to the president, because we do have bipartisan support in the Congress for supporting the international efforts in regards to the development of a vaccine. So I am hopeful that you'll see Congress take a different path and try to at least provide some help for U.S. involvement globally.
Great. Our next questions relate specifically to the issue of anti-Semitism. Brad from LA says he's particularly concerned by the reliance of the protesters that we have seen use Nazi imagery, comparing governors who support stay-at-home orders to Hitler. Can elected Democrats at the highest levels speak more loudly against these shameful images?
Well, exactly what we have to do, and we have to speak out. You cannot be silent against bigotry, and you really do need to speak out. And I can assure you that this senator will continue to do that. And I know there's a lot of people in your organization that speak out regularly, and we are monitoring this very, very closely. We do know during pandemics that vulnerable communities become more vulnerable. We saw before COVID-19 the rise of anti-Semitism, and it became deadly, as we saw here in the United States. So yes, we need, the first thing we do when we see any types of anti-Semitic activities is to make sure that responsible leaders speak out against it. We have not had that clear message coming from the President of the United States. We know that ever since what we saw in Virginia. And we are still, I think, suffering from the President's failure to condemn that type of outrageous racist type conduct. But we have to make up for that. We have to speak out.
Great. The questions just keep on coming, so I'll keep on asking. Ken in Colorado asks, since President Trump and his administration ignore human rights in the context of COVID-19, what can the American people do to help change political inaction? I have sent emails and called Senator Cory Gardner, this is Ken's senator, but what can those do who don't have a senator like you that responds to constituents?
Well, no, don't give up hope. I mean, I really do urge you to continue to speak out on these issues. Make sure your senators, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, know your views. Believe me, I mean, Cory Gardner's up for re-election, so he clearly is going to pay attention to the calls that he's receiving. he has to know that people are watching. And believe me, it makes a difference. As I said earlier, we have seen action by the Senate overriding President Trump's policies. We've done that in Russia. We've done that in Turkey, foreign policy issues. We've done that on funding issues, on foreign aid. As you know, the president almost zeroed out a lot of our programs around the world. The Congress put that money back in. So speaking out can make a difference. So clearly, make sure you exercise your rights with your representatives.
Great. Ariana Burrows in Pennsylvania asked about the issue of vote by mail. Shouldn't the next legislation that the Congress passes provide support for the U.S. Postal Service, which is so necessary for mail-in ballots, and to state and local government, which must pay the police, fire, teachers, and first responders who are on the front lines of this crisis?
Well, thanks for asking that question. I should have mentioned that with our priorities on the next aid package. Clearly, protecting our election security is one of the areas that we really want to make a priority. Yes, we do that as Democrats because Democrats believe in the democratic system of government. We believe in our institutions. We believe in free and fair elections. We would like to see every eligible voter vote, and we would like to see more eligible voters. That's what we believe in. That's democracy. Unfortunately, the Republicans of late, not always, but in the last 10 years, the Republicans have said it's fair game to try to reduce participation by those voters that are more likely to vote Democrat than Republican. That's outrageous. So they've made it difficult for people with criminal records to vote. They made it difficult for older people to be able to vote with ID laws. They made it more difficult for people to vote by having early voting and having easier for absentee voting. And now they're trying to make it more difficult for people to vote by denying voting by mail, knowing that there's a public health risk to go to a voting place in person. This is just un-American. It's not democratic, and we got to continue to push to have the widest possible participation at the polls. That requires a reliable postal service. So for the purposes of our election, it's a reason enough to say, yes, we should be providing additional support to the postal system to make sure that universal mail delivery and collection can be made in the United States. There is no other entity that does universal service. It's in the Constitution of the United States. We have to make sure that we maintain that. And yes, we have to provide some help, particularly for what we call the legacy costs, which is the fact that they have a lot of retirement expenses for the workers, that we have to provide help. And it should not be solely on increasing the rates of postage. We need to have more public support.
Great. I will also add on that note that Deborah Cooper has also asked about the Postal Service. So I'm glad that you are addressing that. Moving along, Daniel has asked about the World Health Organization. A global pandemic requires the WHO, which Trump refuses to fund. Does he have the authority to do that without congressional approval?
Well, that's a great question because we have funded the World Health Organization. The challenge is that it's not a line item in the budget. It's part of an overall category of expenditures. So there was not one single line in the budget that mandated the U.S. contributions to the World Health Organization. But like many other organizations, there are different ways that we participate, and we are still participating in some respect with the World Health Organization. So it's our hope that Congress will find a way to overcome what the president has attempted to do. But the president, particularly during emergencies, has broad authority. This president, even if he doesn't have authority, tries to exercise that. We know that he has tried to take over the courts. He's tried to take over the Congress. We got to hold him accountable because he's abused his discretion so often. Yes, we think he can cause damage to U.S. participation in the World Health Organization. But ultimately, we hope that Congress can repair some of that.
Great. We have a question from Jacob Kornblue from Jewish Insider. He's asking specifically about the letter that was recently circulated, led by Senator Van Hollen, related to Israel. In case you have not seen it, it's a letter to Prime Minister Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, warning them about the potential of or the consequences of Israeli annexation of portions of the West Bank. The question is, how might annexation affect U.S.-Israel relations, and are you considering signing on to the letter?
Well, thank you for that question. I have enough time with U.S. politics, but let me get a little bit into Israel politics. I love the United States of America. I strongly disagree with our president. I think he has led this country in a very dangerous way, and I'll continue to speak out where I think he is doing things that are wrong, and it has nothing to do with my respect and love for this country and the history of this country and the future of this country. I love and respect Israel. It's a great democratic state in the midst of a very dangerous area where there are few or any real democracies that exist. Israel represents values that are constant to our values. They're a reliable ally of the United States where we can get reliable information, military information, intelligence information. So it is a relationship that started with President Truman in 1948 as a special relationship, which has been extremely beneficial to Israel's development and security and the United States development and security. That relationship is critically important today, critically important. Israel is a key ally of the United States of America, and it is a democratic state that has independent judiciary, that has rule of law, that has accountability. And I think we must recognize that. And its neighbors do not have that, including the Palestinian Authority does not have that type of accountability. And it's a dangerous place where dangerous things happen. So I don't like to second guess with Israel's government's decisions, although I have been pretty critical of a lot of policies under the Netanyahu prime ministership. To me, the only lasting peace in the Middle East will come in Israel with two states living side by side in peace, a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. And that we have to preserve that peace process, even though at this time it's unlikely we can get to the finish line. So when you talk about annexation, I look at it in context as to how does it advance the ultimate solution of the two states between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And I find unilateral action not to be a helpful process. So I have concerns about the annexation issues. I think Israel is trying to implement a two-state solution unilaterally. I think there's risk factors about that. I would encourage them instead to try to preserve the process, but I don't think it is helpful for us to sow dissension in the United States as it relates to the support for Israel. I think we have to show that even when we disagree with the policies of the government, that the relationship between the United States and Israel must remain strong.
Thank you so much, Senator. Our final question comes from Steve in Illinois, and it's a good segue into Mark's presentation. And it's just how your Jewish values inform your view as it relates to refugees and immigration. And with that, we will let you go back to the important work of the Senate.
Well, believe me, I think I'm doing more important work here right now. But thanks again, and thanks for that question, because I think about that frequently. I really do. I grew up in a neighborhood that was 100% Jewish. It was a very comfortable existence for me. I remember when I was collecting for the Jewish National Fund, because I got little prizes for getting the most money collected, and I knocked on a home. And somebody told me they weren't Jewish. I didn't know what they meant. I thought the whole world was Jewish. So I grew up in a very Zionist Jewish community in which values were part of our life. Every day at dinner, we talked about helping others. We talked about the migrant immigration communities and what we could do to help the immigration communities. And we collected money for that. And we collected money to help other people. So Tikkun Olam, trying to repair the world, tzedakah was all part of what I believe was our responsibilities. My mother and father of blessed memory both were very active in public service. So this came natural to me. So there is no inconsistency for me in my Jewish values in what I believe should be the priorities of our country and my representation as a public official. And that is to promote values that we are there to serve others, that we want to help the most vulnerable, that the world needs to be a friendlier place, that we shouldn't block our borders to those who are in desperate need. That all to me is part of the values I grew up in and is what has made America the great nation it is. So there's no inconsistency here. Believe me, it rips me apart when I go to McAllen, Texas, and I see what our country has done with people who are only trying to live their life with some degree of safety and their children to have some future, and only to find a brick wall put up for the United States and them told to wait under extremely dangerous circumstances to make their claims for asylum, and then in many cases being turned away. To me, that just rips me apart, and it's just not what this country stands for. Immigrants have made this nation the great nation it is. And I'm proud that my grandparents came to this country. I think they added to the value of America. I think immigrants add to the value of this country. Yes, we need an orderly process, but it's got to be done consistent with our values and protecting the world's vulnerable people. So it's a great question, and one in which I'm proud of my Jewish heritage, and why I'm so proud of the Democratic Party, because I think it reflects those values, particularly in these times when we see a rise of nationalism and we see xenophobia developing and racism. To me, it just reinforces how important it is for us to stay true to our values.
Thank you so much, Senator. We deeply appreciate it. I too am a constituent here in Maryland. We're very proud to have you representing us in the Senate. Thank you.
Well, it's good to be with you all. And again, thanks for all the work you're doing. And Mark, I know you're coming up next. You have a lot of friends here in Capitol Hill.
Thank you, Senator.
Great. And back over to Barbara Goldberg-Goldman to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Halie, and thank you for really coordinating this fantastic call. And now everybody gets to see why Senator Cardin's leadership is so valued here in Maryland and elsewhere. I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you Mark Hetfield, the CEO of HIAS. Founded in 1881 to assist Jews fleeing the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, HIAS recently celebrated 139 years of helping refugees escape persecution and resettle in safety, reuniting families who have been separated and helping them build new lives in safety and in freedom. Starting in the 2000s, HIAS expanded its resettlement work to include non-Jewish refugees and assisting those displaced from countries such as Afghanistan, Bosnia, Ethiopia, Haiti, Hungary, Iran, Morocco, Poland, Romania, Syria, Tunisia, and Vietnam. HIAS CEO Mark Hetfield first joined the organization in 1989 as a caseworker in Rome. He was working for the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, a large law firm, as an immigration attorney, and he has held multiple roles at HIAS over the years. Since being named HIAS's president and CEO in 2013, Mark has led the transformation of HIAS from its days of helping refugees because they were Jewish to now helping refugees because we are Jewish. HIAS resettles refugees of all faiths and ethnicities as a major implementing partner of the United Nations Refugee Agency and the United States Department of State. As a reminder, please keep sending in your questions to info@jewishdems.org. And thank you so much again for joining us. Today, Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. And it is a great honor to follow Senator Cardin. He is also my senator. And since HIAS moved its global headquarters to Silver Spring, Maryland 5 years ago, he is HIAS's senator as well. And he has always been a champion for refugees and immigrants who have helped make the United States a great country. Now, HIAS, unlike JDCA, is a nonpartisan organization, and for that reason, I want to start by mentioning something that the Trump administration has done right. The Trump administration is providing assistance to refugees overseas, including $1.7 billion in funding to the UN Refugee Agency at record levels. This is, however, not nearly enough given that there are more forcibly displaced persons today than there have been at any time in human history. But still, I do need to give credit where credit is due. We can't take this administration's funding of the UN Refugee Agency for granted, as the administration pulled the funding from other UN agencies without any notice, including the WFP, in the middle of a global pandemic. So for that, we're grateful. I also need to credit Congress, which has continued to fund refugee assistance at a higher level each year than requested by the administration, and included $350 million for refugees to address refugee needs with regard to COVID-19 in the CARES Act. I would also add that the State Department has been very flexible with their partners like HIAS on the 5 continents where we operate in addressing the needs of refugees during this global pandemic. Funding for refugee assistance is very important. However, it is no more important than setting an example for the rest of the world in the way that we treat refugees and asylum seekers. Here, the Trump administration is also showing leadership, but leadership in the wrong direction, leadership to the bottom. The global refugee crisis, with 71 million displaced persons, over 1/3 of whom have had to flee their country, cannot be solved by any one government. The crisis requires each country to do what we can to share responsibility. But like this pandemic, the world refugee crisis requires global cooperation. The refugee crisis cannot be solved by one country alone. The rest of the world has long looked to the US for leadership, and the United States is simply not providing it anymore. Senator Cardin spoke of the outrageous xenophobic language used by this administration and this president, and that too is where I want to focus my remarks. Language matters, words matter, and calling asylum a scam and asylum seekers invaders is hate speech, pure and simple. Not the kind of leadership we want in this country or on this planet, especially from a country that is a nation of refugees and immigrants. The Trump administration has also used Orwellian language to implement its refugee programs, using ironic names which are the exact opposite of what those programs actually do. For example, the Remain in Mexico program is actually called the Migrant Protection Protocols. This is the program in which the Trump administration pushes non-Mexican asylum seekers back into Mexico, requiring them to wait there in extremely dangerous conditions without access to counsel, work, or material assistance for months until their court hearing in the United States. This program has absolutely nothing to do with protection, which is why we at HIAS and many others call it Remain in Mexico, not the Migrant Protection Protocols. And these refugees are at very high risk of COVID-19 due to the crowded encampments in which they must live. HIAS is all too familiar with the plight of these asylum seekers, as we are now operating in Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, Monterrey, and Mexicali, Mexico. And in theory, at least the Remain in Mexico policy allowed for some exceptions for individuals who affirmatively expressed and established a fear of harm. But even that narrow exception was ended on March 20th when the administration invoked a 1944 law, the Public Health Act. Now, even asylum seekers who fear immediate harm must still wait in Mexico. This is a violation of the 1980 Refugee Act, which created an asylum process which the administration is simply not at liberty to ignore, yet it does. And before March 20th, when the US allowed some asylum seekers in without forcing them back to Mexico, those asylum seekers were immediately placed in detention. Most of them still remain there, in spite of the dangers of overcrowded conditions they face in the detention centers, where reports are that there is neither social distancing nor regular access to soap or hand sanitizer. These detention centers are, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from jails, even though those asylum seekers have committed no crime. And then there's the misnamed Safe Third Country agreements that the United States has entered into with Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, in which the US sends asylum seekers back to those countries without a hearing, if the asylum seeker passed through that country on their way to the United States. The Trump administration has entered into these so-called safe third country agreements with the very countries from which record numbers of people are fleeing, precisely because conditions there are unsafe. And finally, with regard to our Orwellian language and refugee resettlement, I would be remiss if I did not mention the executive order, which was misnamed the Executive Order on Enhancing State and Local Involvement in Refugee Resettlement. This executive order did the exact opposite of enhancing state and local refugee involvement in refugee resettlement. The EO simply allowed states to end their involvement in refugee resettlement. It did nothing to enhance the involvement. HIAS sued, and in HIAS v. Trump, we, together with Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, Church World Service, and the International Refugee Assistance Project, challenged this illegal executive order in court. The EO violates the Refugee Act of 1980, which contemplated very specific engagement of state and local governments in refugee resettlement, and the EO violates the US Constitution, as the regulation of immigration and foreign policy is a federal function, not a state function. Fortunately, the Federal District Court in Maryland agreed with us and issued an injunction against this executive order, even though 41 states had already opted in and only Texas had opted out. By the time the president had signed this EO, however, much damage had already been done. He had already decimated US leadership in resettling refugees to the United States, lowering the refugee admission ceiling from 110,000 to 45,000, the lowest number in the 40 years of the program, to 30,000, and then this year to 18,000, a new record low. And since March, due to the global pandemic, the refugee program has been suspended entirely except for emergency cases. Now, we are in a global pandemic, but we need to make sure that this suspension is not extended for one day longer than it needs to be. Back in 1980, President Carter and the Congress demonstrated true leadership by passing the Refugee Act. That year, when we were facing another global refugee crisis, with Indo-Chinese boat people, Cuban boat people, Iranian religious minorities fleeing revolutionary Iran, and Soviet Jewish migrants, the United States showed true leadership by welcoming 207,112 refugees. That year, then Vice President Mondale told an international refugee conference in Geneva that in 1938 at the Evian conference, we had failed the test of civilization by not acting to save the Jews of Europe, and that we must not fail that test again. The Refugee Convention was written in 1951 to ensure that never again would humanity allow people to be trapped inside a genocide or inside a country where they face persecution because of who they are or what they believe. In 1980, when the Refugee Act passed Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, a law implemented by President Carter and then by President Reagan, the United States demonstrated true leadership. We need that leadership once again. Back to you, Barbara.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. I'm happy to, again, moderate the questions. We've received quite a few. So our first comes from Daniel Gordon. He is thanking you and HIAS for your focus on immigrants. However, there's a problem in the country when the country of immigrants doesn't recognize the government's inhumane treatment of immigrants. Stephen Miller is no doubt responsible, including Jared Kushner, who should be called out for his silence given his own family history. Daniel is asking for your thoughts on this, and I would just add that just in the past 2 days, we've seen in the New York Times confirmation of what we suspected to be the case, that is that this White House is using this global pandemic as an opportunity to push through increasingly restrictive immigration and refugee measures. So if you could speak to what we've seen specifically in recent weeks as it relates to the White House policy on immigration.
Well, I could take hours to answer that question. I mean, I will say that when President Trump took office, we actually have Jared Kushner's family file because we brought Jared Kushner's grandparents to the United States. And immediately after President Trump took office, I sent that file to Jared Kushner, hoping it would influence his father-in-law's actions. But then a week later, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, President Trump signed the refugee ban and the Muslim ban. So obviously that was not successful. And likewise, HIAS also helped bring Stephen Miller's family to the United States, and his uncle is a HIAS contributor and volunteer. But once again, we have not had any luck in influencing Stephen Miller, who has considerable influence over U.S. immigration policy. And now, obviously, it makes sense to take border controls, measures to control the border when there is a pandemic. I mean, that's normal, and a state has the right to do that. But it needs to take into account, as I said in my remarks, asylum requirements. It needs to make sure that people who are fleeing persecution still have access to territory and to safety. And the administration is deliberately ignoring the law and not allowing that. And there's no doubt, and you saw in the New York Times recently, that there was a report that indeed the White House is using this pandemic as a rationale for implementing its anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, anti-asylum agenda. And as we open up, we have to keep a very close eye on things to make sure that those measures do not last one day longer than this pandemic calls for.
Thank you. We have a few questions specifically about HIAS, not necessarily about immigration, however. Perhaps it's related. One comes from Adele in California. Why is the ZOA smearing the reputation of HIAS? Adele says, I've read about the controversy, but how can I help HIAS counter these smears? And L from DC asks, what do you say to those organizations who have recently unfairly criticized HIAS and some of its members? How can we make the issue of refugee resettlement and asylum seekers bipartisan once again?
Well, I would like to know what the answer to that question is, because I ask myself that question every day. As I said, in 1980, one book I read about the Refugee Act of 1980 said it passed with a fantastic lack of notice. And indeed, that's what we miss. Refugees used to be a totally bipartisan issue, but refugees were kind of weaponized. It became a polarizing issue in 2015 when 31 governors, 30 of whom were Republicans, and the House of Representatives, then controlled by Republicans, decided that they were going to blame refugees for a terrorist attack that had occurred in Paris, notwithstanding that not a single Syrian refugee was behind that attack. And yet 30 Republican governors said they were going to ban Syrian refugees from their states. So that's when it really became a highly partisan issue. And we've been trying to make it bipartisan ever since. And in terms of the question about ZOA, that comes in the context of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, which is an umbrella organization, not well known maybe, but very important, which brings together the chairmen and the chairwomen and the CEOs of most, not all, but most major Jewish organizations in the United States. And my former chair was just elected the new chairwoman of the Conference of Presidents. And since that time, we have come under relentless attack from a small number of member agencies, including ZOA, as you mentioned, which are attacking HIAS and saying, among many other things, that we are no longer a Jewish organization because we don't help many Jews, because we help Muslims. Well, I have to tell you, we help everybody. We help Muslims, we help Christians, and we certainly help Jews. And we are more Jewish than ever. We just like to say that we used to help refugees because they were Jewish, and today we help refugees because we are Jewish. And there is nothing more Jewish than welcoming the stranger, which is why the Torah tells us to do that 36 times. So I just would love it if everybody would counter those lies and those myths in your own communities when you hear them. And you can contact us at HIAS, and we're more than happy to help you do that.
Thank you. Ariel from San Francisco asks about the impact of COVID-19 on detention camps. Can you tell us more about the deportation of COVID-19 positive asylum seekers and the conditions within the camps?
Well, if you mean actually the detention centers in the United States, I mean, those detention centers are very much, the conditions are absolutely indistinguishable from jails. And many of them are under private contract. Many are operated by the federal government. They previously did not even allow access to hand sanitizer. Soap is difficult to come by. All of them are overcrowded. And even though these people have committed no crimes, they have not been released since. They are not being released as a matter of policy. They're being detained there, and we're just awaiting some serious outbreaks like we have seen in many of the prisons across the United States. And then of course when they're deported into equally overcrowded conditions without any kind of testing. And we have seen, for example, the United States through deportations introduced COVID-19 to several communities in Guatemala, which received some of these deportees. So it's a very serious problem, and it's one which should be dealt with by releasing asylum seekers, allowing them to be in a place where they can practice social distancing and access things like soap. But that's not happening.
Thank you. Our next question relates to public opinion and how Americans see immigrants. Jamie from Florida asks, how is the way that Americans view immigrants affected by their country of origin?
That's by the country of origin. I'm asking you to interpret this. By the country of origin of the immigrants themselves, or of...
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and and of course, HIAS is more focused on refugees, while our middle name is immigrant. That's because we were started in a year when there was no legal term for refugees, even though the people we help have always been people who fled persecution. So I'll talk about that in the context of refugees. And what we have found is sadly, even though this is a country of immigrants and refugees, that most Americans, frankly, have not been terribly warm and fuzzy toward refugees. Some, a significant minority are, but refugees do not poll well. In most polls, in most refugee crises, about 2 Americans opposed bringing in refugees for every 1 that was in favor of it. This was true in the 1930s when the United States considered bringing in Jewish children from Nazi Germany. And that bill, the Wagner-Rogers bill, was actually failed because of that lack of political support. And then again, in the Vietnamese boat crisis in the late 1970s, about 2/3 of Americans were against bringing in refugees. And the same polling occurred in a few years ago with regard to the Syrian refugee crisis, where about 2/3 of Americans said they really didn't want more Syrian refugees coming to this country. The only exception to this that I'm aware of was in 1999 during the Kosovo refugee crisis, when 2/3 of Americans were in favor of bringing these Kosovar Muslims from Yugoslavia to the United States. I don't know why that is. My theory is that because this was a refugee crisis which unfolded on live television, on CNN, and we watched it in real time, and you couldn't help but be sympathetic for these poor people who were running for their lives and had no place to go. And in those days, we didn't have the Fox News filter, which gives a different spin to these things. So that's my own theory. But that was the only exception I know of when there really was kind of a welcome for refugees who were fleeing here. Most of the time, it does take leadership and courage on behalf of our politicians and leaders, because refugees are not popular, even though they do contribute to this country, even though, as the study commissioned by the Trump administration said, which they later suppressed, that over a 20-year period, refugees contributed $63 billion more in state, local, and federal taxes than they took in services. Thank you.
Our next question is from Susie in New York. She's asking about the correlation between the restrictive immigration policies of this administration and whether you've seen an increase in human or child trafficking.
Yeah, that's a good question, and the answer, the short answer is yes, because when you shut the door and you no longer have a legal way to get in, people are going to try to use more dangerous routes. And this is why a really robust and significant refugee resettlement program is so important. This is why you need a strong program like we had in the early 1980s when, as I said, the United States admitted over 200,000 refugees in a single year. Because refugees, particularly refugees who want to unite with family, are going to do so no matter what, and put their lives at great risk, put their lives in the hands of smugglers, put their lives in the hands of human traffickers. And this is exactly what happens when you do not have a legal route to enter. And yet, even though this administration claims to be a proponent of legal immigration, rhetorically, we know from their actions they are not. We know that they have shut down the refugee program and whittled it down very close to zero, even though no program is more legal and more controlled and more safe and secure than the refugee resettlement program. We know that they shut down the Central American Minors Program that was set up by the Obama administration, which provided a safe and legal route for Central American asylum-seeking children to come to the United States so they wouldn't have to risk their lives crossing the desert. Yet that was shut down by this administration. So yes, certainly smuggling and trafficking increases when you shut off legal routes, and that's exactly what we're doing in this country, and we're not alone. They're doing the same thing in Europe.
Thank you. Well, we do try to stay on time, so we will wrap there, but I will share, to end on a positive note, a comment that's come in from Jamie Kent. Jamie has said his father ran HIAS in Toronto in the 1960s, and he would have been proud of your determination, as we all are. Thank you so much, Mark. I think it's very important that you remind us all that welcoming strangers mentioned the Torah 36 times. We do have an obligation, and you're really living that with the mission of HIAS, and we appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Halie. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will turn it back over to our chair, Ron Klein, to wrap the call.
Thank you, Halie, and thank you to Senator Cardin and Mark Hetfield for sharing their perspective and insight. And thanks to all of you for joining our 9th call in our Democrats Leading in Crisis Call series. Please visit jewishdems.org today to support JDCA, join one of our chapters, sign up for our first National Day of Action on May 17th. We're organizing digitally in advance of the most important election of our lifetime, and hopefully all of you can join us. In conclusion, I'll remind you that today is Giving Tuesday. Amid much uncertainty facing Americans right now, one thing is certain. We will have the most important election of our lifetime in 6 months. JDCA is organizing in advance of that election to advocate for our values and elect those who share our values, and we need your help. So please visit jewishdems.org to support our efforts today. I hope you will join us again next Tuesday for one of our crisis calls. Stay healthy and safe. We'll see you soon. Thank you.